You can do it, Sanjeev. Do it. Okay, you can do it.
So Alex Rudnicki is leading the team on dialogue modeling and evaluation, and he will be joined by Lazaros Polymenakos from Amazon, and they will both first present their project idea and then handle Q&A from the audience. And again, audience, thank you very much. This was a great Q&A. Please continue, and we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions. So stay on. Alex, all yours.
Okay, thank you. Let me rearrange my screens. Okay, so welcome to the what is currently the Chanel workshop. It used to be the Cheval, but then we realized we needed an N there to represent natural language, and so we came up with Chanel. So this workshop has really two thrusts, both having to do with essentially interactive systems. One has to do with end-to-end NLU, so basically from speech to concept. And the other bit has to do with metrics that can be used to measure the success of a conversation. Now, both of these are actually fairly difficult problems. I should point out that there's a differentiation in speech systems, interactive speech systems. There are goal-directed systems, and there are, well, sometimes called open domain systems. The point being is there's no particular task, concrete task being performed, and therefore there's no clear way to know that, well, you got your ticket or change your balance at the bank or whatnot. The sort of goals that are present are more of a social kind. And, well, we don't really know how to measure that except by having people do it, which of course is highly, well, expensive. So what I'd like to do, what we ended up doing is deciding that there actually were three thrusts in the workshop, and we'll be describing those in turn. Basically, the issues have to do with, and I'm basically skipping around a bit, have to do with what I described, the NLU and the evaluation, but it also has to do with acquiring new speech data. When we looked at the kinds of corpora that were available, of which there's quite a bit, there was always something wrong with one or the other. So we thought an important thing for us to do is actually create a corpus that has the characteristics that we would want. And these, generally speaking, are that it's speech, and we actually collect the speech. We have a non-trivial interactive task between a system, or we could call it a bot, and a human. And the data, there's sufficient amount of data properly organized that ourselves and other researchers can, well, do interesting things. So in terms of the participants in this workshop, there are 12 senior researchers, and there are 18 students, and there's a number of additional participants who've been able to commit for smaller amounts of time, but at the same time have particular kinds of expertise that are relevant. Now, I actually have a spreadsheet rather than a nicely arranged slide, mostly because we, in fact, there's still a bit of churn in who exactly wishes to contribute and what exactly they will be able to do. But basically, as I said, there's perhaps a dozen senior participants and a number of student participants, and in addition, people who are part-time in one sense or another. So let's see if we go back to here. Let's move on. So as I said, there's really 3 activities that we'll be pursuing: modeling approaches for speech-to-concept NLU, discovering or figuring out automated evaluation metrics for conversation, and creating a human-machine conversation corpus that is contains the bits that are actually at this time considered to be of use in ongoing work. So in terms of on a very high view, what we're doing is there's an initiation period, which we're basically currently in. There's activities that are specific to the different directions. And what we thought would be useful is the data collection will produce a corpus. That corpus can then be used by the other 2 activities to do some kind of evaluation on essentially on the same data. So of course the results will be different. They're not, they're qualitatively different, but we feel it's important to get some sense of whether the data produces interesting results and interpretations in the context of those 2 activities. So moving on, I'd like to talk a bit about data collection. So this turned out to be a head scratcher. So initially we thought, well, hey, we have lots of systems that everybody's working on. Why don't we use those? And it turned out that actually there, as I mentioned earlier, there was a set of limitations for any one particular system. However, we thought that maybe there really was one class of system that could satisfy the requirements that we had. It is actually a fairly complex domain, but maybe that's useful in the long run. So it turns out that two of the sites, 2 of the universities participating in this workshop also are participating in the Alexa Prize Challenge. And just roughly speaking, what that is building a system, building a social bot, as they call them, that can engage a human for at least 20 minutes of conversation, which actually is pretty challenging. So think of whether you can talk to another person for that long and keep being interested. I'm sure we can, but you can imagine it's not trivial. And so again, 2 of the sites participating in that volunteered their systems to be used in a separate data collection effort within this workshop. And the 2 systems are Gunrock and Tartan. Gunrock is so far has been the best performing system in the competition, where best performing is liked the most by the users who answered the question, would you like to talk with this thing again? There's additional criteria in the challenge, such as the duration, but the sort of the headline number is, do the people want to talk to you again? So Davis had the best system last year, and so far they've had the best system this year. The CMU system, Tartan, is somewhere the mid-range of the pack, And we thought this is actually kind of useful because, among other things, these two systems represent different approaches to the problem of keeping people engaged and really have, well, different philosophies. So that seemed like a useful feature. So we will be able to run these systems on Amazon AWS in the cloud. And fortunately, both these systems already exist there. And running them separately is basically, well, to my mind, an administrative issue. So you run separate copies and you fence them in somehow, and access is only possible through authorized users. So basically, the procedure will be to recruit people, use basically obtain proper releases so that speech is available. And so the sites as a group will solicit participants and plug them into the system for this purpose. So again, we will get speech, which surprisingly is not available very often in this particular field, mostly for privacy reasons, but it's also, as you might imagine, a pain to collect and organize. All the bots have logs and various other kinds of information. There's some automatically generated material like transcriptions and various classifications such as intents. These would need to be corrected for further use. And in addition to that, the sessions will be annotated using the scheme developed by the metrics activity. And finally, this will be packaged up as a publicly available corpus, which we hope will be a great use to, well, to the world. So just because I happen to have this around, this is a human readable log.
Hey, Alec.
Yep.
Interruption. You're in edit mode. If you could do full screen, we
Oh,
might.
I'm sorry.
Better. Thank you.
Yeah, I tend to like to see all the stuff around. But anyways, we're not really meant to read this in great detail, but this is sort of a slice of the kind of information that becomes available once you have logging information for particular systems. So anyway, one thing I should point out, the recognition is actually pretty good in this environment. Although actually it does need to be corrected. Anyway, so at this point, I would like to ask Lazaros to take over and talk about the end-to-end speech spoken language understanding component. Lazaros?
Hi, can you hear me?
I can hear you, hopefully.
Yeah. Thank you, Alex, for the introduction and for all the hard work. So I'll speak briefly about the end-to-end spoken language understanding track. Next slide. So the main idea here is that current systems use a pipeline where first they transcribe the spoken the spoken utterances, and then natural language understanding is applied on them in order to do, let's say, things like what Alexa does. The, let's say, limitation of this is that on one hand, we are not taking advantage of the various speech-related cues for the natural language understanding. And secondly, we do not train these two systems jointly in order to, let's say, for the task, which is basically the natural language understanding, which we train them separately and for different objectives. The objective of ASR is to have perfect transcription, and the objective of NLU is to extract from that transcription the linguistic components that we need in order to understand the sentence. However, of course, nothing is perfect, and let's say that the transcription is wrong, and then the NLU, which has been trained on perfect utterances, cannot cope with it. So the idea is that by looking into end-to-end architectures, we may be able to improve eventually the overall system. Of course, this is a great challenge since right now these individual systems, the ASR and the NLU, have undergone many, let's say, cycles of improvement over the years. But the challenge here is to be able to tie these components together and even simplify the stack. We may not need a full transcription in order to do this task, since we'll be training in order to understand the natural language component. So we want to, how should I put it, push the boundary here of the state of the art, and also of student and researcher ingenuity to find ways to combine and fine-tune jointly such components, and even forego, if possible, in these architectures, the full transcription of the spoken utterances. Next slide. So the idea is that we start with acoustic features. We may use ASR and have some other intermediate representation, and then do natural language understanding on that intermediate representation and get the output we want. The idea is to train the system also end-to-end, rather than in individual components with different optimization methods. Next slide. So there are many modeling challenges. First, bridge the gap between NLU only and the ASR only datasets. Datasets, ASR datasets come with transcription. They are generic sources, not necessarily always goal-oriented dialogues, and often they do not have annotations of intent, slot, and value. NLU, there are text-only datasets which are lacking audio, so the input modality is currently just text. We would like to change that and go to speech. And the interface between the ASR and the NLU part is just the transcription and the discrete labels. So we want to change that. We want to be able to go directly from speech to NLU part. I think we are all cognizant of this area, but I'll just say, even to lighten the discussion, that you don't need full transcription in order to understand that somebody is saying, for example, yes to you. They may say something crazy or something that you do not know as a local idiom, and still understand that they are agreeing with you, okay? So you may ask, would you like to buy this ticket, for example? And the person may say, you betcha. So maybe this, you don't know this idiom, or this is not transcribed properly. Still, the result is a positive answer, a confirmation. And we want to focus on multi-turn dialogues. What is the challenge here? The challenge is that you have to keep context from multiple turns. And the challenge here is to see, do you need this context to be from the transcribed part, or from what you have understood already, or keep the audio somehow as reference to find out new things that you weren't able to extract from previous turns. Next slide, please.
Oop.
So the research questions, I think we have said some of them already. There's the integration of dialogue evaluation metrics as objective function, the fusion of system components, ASR and NLU, and minimize pre-training so as to reduce also the need for data-hungry approaches. Combination of different tasks and train with increased complexity. That could be, let's say, some end-to-end training, and transfer learning between languages. This is a stretch goal. It depends on the availability of data. There are partners in our program who are collecting data and annotating them in different languages. And that could become also, let's say, a challenge either during our workshop or in the future. Next slide, please. So there are various available data sets, some of them recent, some of them from times past. For example, from a lot of even recent papers report on 80s, even though this is a very old data set. But there are newer data sets like the fluent speech, SNPs, and others that could be a starting point for this discussion. The, let's say, limitation is that these are small, relatively, data sets, but we are going to augment what exists already with the data that will be collected by this workshop. These data sets may be a good starting point or a good adaptation point for people to start, for researchers to start their work, see that they're progressing, and then we can test on the data collected by this workshop. Okay. Next slide. So here are some milestones. Week 1 will be a setup of infrastructure, a deep dive into related work and papers and approaches, and also to establish baselines. Actually, we have a team at Amazon, both of researchers from different departments and of interns who are working currently to establish a baseline. We will share the numbers of the baseline so that they can become a starting point, and we'll share also our learnings about some initial architecture on that. Then week 2 will have the completion of some first runs, try out some of the existing, let's say, architectures that have been proposed. Then people will try model and parameter optimization. In week 4, there will be integration of dialog evaluation methods as objective function. Week 5 will be to retrain and fine-tune the models based on the data collected during the workshop. And then week 6 will wrap up experimentation. However, we believe that beyond the, let's say, the duration of the workshop, people will be able to work on this problem and complete their work and become a basis for good publications. Of course, there are challenges, the distributed collaboration across different sites, time zones, the fact that we are not physically present in a contained area to help people, and of course, the actual challenges of this task. Next slide, please. So there are quite a few participants in this. LIMSI, with senior participants Sarah Ganey, and from CMU, Ian Lane, with 2 students from Amazon. It's Marcus Miller and myself. And there is also others who are working on this, and we should mention them. I'll send their names. And there are 2 student participants, Bhuvan and Brandon. Next slide, please. So back to you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'll go off the network so that I do not cause disruptions.
Thank you, Lazaros. So I will now like to describe the metrics track that we developed. So basically, as I alluded to previously, the basic problem is there's no really good way to evaluate open domain systems. And they're called various things like chat systems, social bots. But irrespective of that, we don't really know how to evaluate them. So we're basically back to basically back to human judgment. So you either have a participant that tells you they like what happened or not, or you have an outside judge that looks at or listens to one of these conversations and makes some kind of judgment. A long time ago, I heard Raj Reddy refer to this as the Olympic model, where basically you have judges and they have these cards with numbers on them that they put up. You have no idea what's going on in their heads, but you have a number. Of course, in our environment, that's not really a great way of doing things, because you don't really know why it's a 5, why it's a 7.5, and so forth. So we need to have metrics and that are really, well, two things. More analytic, more explicatory, but also ones that can then be used in different modeling approaches to improving these systems, evaluating them, and so forth. So roughly speaking, these are agents that, well, if you show up at a party, well, you don't have to, but typically you make conversation with others, and really it's not like you're pursuing some goal, unless you're there to sell stuff. But you want to have a pleasant exchange with somebody for a while until you run out of drink or food, then you wander off. The one way of looking at it is that these kinds of interactions don't have a single goal as in task-oriented dialogue, but there are multiple goals, and pretty much a number of them have to do with social goals. I want to be your friend, and so forth. And these things are actually kind of really hard to measure. But what we're talking about is not at that level of things. We really would like to be a level down from that and be able to measure particular phenomena that are diagnostic of how well a conversation is going. So I've mentioned some of these things. Basically, it's not something we're used to measuring. One solution has been to try and take stuff from other fields like machine translation, and if you think about it, that's really not a good idea, because it doesn't tell you anything. And we still need something. So as in other fields, in particular speech recognition, nothing really started to work in an organized fashion until there were clear metrics that everybody agreed on could be used. And that's one of our goals. And as I also mentioned, learning-based approaches need this kind of information. They're effectively a labeling of the data, which you have to start with when you do these things. Okay, so the goal is to identify measurable properties of interaction, rather than I like to talk to this thing again. There may be global properties, such as it's a coherent conversation. I know what we're talking about and I keep going on it. And on a lower level, there's what I have here is turn acceptability. If I say something that just doesn't make sense in the immediate context, and that's not so good. And again, the goal here is to have automatically computable metrics that actually reflect the kinds of judgments that people might have. So so what follows these things is a rather detailed plan, which I hesitate to share because it's so detailed, but let me go through it. So like other activities, we go through a process of setting stuff up, looking, well, let me just wing this rather than reading it. So really what we need to do is figure out and assess the kinds of metrics that have been developed to date. Some have been automated, many have been subjective. What does this tell us about the kinds of things that we should be looking for? A number of us have individual experience in trying to come up with markup schemes. So like at the moment, students in my group are looking at the problem of identifying the topic within a conversation. And this in turn requires labeling that's respective of that. There are other phenomena such as breakdown or features that might predict that the person just hangs up on you and the conversation stops and so forth. So partially it's a matter of kind of deciding what things are useful, what things would actually tell you about the conversation, and moreover allow you to build automatic systems that use this kind of information to organize their behavior or monitor the quality of the current conversation. And there's some interesting ideas there that we've run across, such as the overall impression of a conversation seems to be based on the last few turns of the conversation as opposed to the whole conversation. And the notion that actually what we should be looking at is something based on episodes, which in turn has to do with topics. We talk about this, we talk about that. Each one of those has some quality of, let's say, success associated with it. And maybe that's the right level of analysis and so forth. So anyways, there's a stage at which we need to understand exactly what it is that we're measuring, what is the structure of these phenomena, which ones are actually useful to pay attention to. And I should also point out what a nice, hopefully nice things about the data collection is now we will also have access to the speech signal and the properties of the signal itself that well, so for instance, prosody and temporal structure that actually would contribute to our understanding of what the speaker is, how the speaker is organizing their performance, if you will. So let's see. The main activities have to do with setting up an infrastructure and identifying resources. Now, we're not going to wait until the data is there to do stuff, but part of it will be to identify and start working with other corpora that have enough of the qualities we want that we can actually start to generate the approach. Another problem is that, well, once you have some features, how exactly do you extract them? What are the what is it exactly that the process entails? So in the previous workshop presentation, we talked about figuring out embeddings for things like speakers and so on. This is roughly the same kind of idea, or the same goal, I should say. The precise work itself is something that will be determined in the workshop. So again, I think I mentioned this, looking at existing work on this, and seeing what's useful there. I think most of us have pretty good intuitions about what should matter, but actually what would be better is to understand, or at least assemble data on what other people have done, and more precisely whether they could actually demonstrate that there was a useful effect, useful metric that came out of it. And finally, the goal is, as I mentioned before, is to have a non-trivial data set corpus of real conversations that include speech and information about the internal state of the system, plus annotations made according to the scheme developed within the workshop. So everybody wants to do this, have open source corpora, but I think in this case it's actually critical to progress in this particular area. There are no truly great corpora. They're all different. That's okay, but we think this one will be better. Okay, so this is a summary of the various deliverables which I've mentioned. So there are particular sub-activities having to do with, the metrics development and developing modeling approaches and so forth. Here's a list of some of the participants. I should point out that from my perspective, that spreadsheet I showed you earlier is kind of it's a superset of this, but I have the optimism that everyone there will contribute something at least to what we're doing. This is a more detailed thing, detailed breakdown of activity by site. And this is some of the corpora that we've identified at this point that are ones that we would use in the process of identifying properties of conversations that, that will be useful for developing an actual metrics system in this context. And that's basically it. So I don't know how we're doing on time, but if you have any questions, then please.
Yes, Alex, we are right on time, no problem. There was already a question. Lazaros, maybe you can come on as well. And there was already a question in the Q&A from Nargis Rokni that said, would it be possible to kindly explain more about the metrics you may want to consider in order to evaluate the conversation quality? You may have answered it in your talk, but if you could just go back to the slide and elaborate a bit more on.
Okay, just out of curiosity, I'm not sure I see the question anywhere.
Go to the Q&A tab and then click on if you go to the bottom of that, you'll see it.
Yeah, well, I have this question and answer panel up, but anyway, it doesn't matter. So the question is, actually, could you repeat the question?
Yeah. Actually, in the Q&A tab, you see something called answered with the number 8 next to it. If you click on that, you'll see it at the bottom of that.
Oh, okay.
I just wrote her saying, I'll ask her question verbally to you. You see it now?
Yeah, I see that. I was first thinking, oh, great, I already answered this, but I guess not. Okay, so good question. So there are one approach that people have used is to have basically a multi-tier scheme that in one rendering has levels such as comprehension and coherence. Comprehension is the system emitted something. Does it make any sense to the human? Good way to know that it doesn't make sense, they come back and say, what? Or that doesn't make sense, and so forth. But in a conversation, people have to be able to understand the individual utterances, and that might, it might be any number of things, and this is something we want to look at. Coherence means things like, are are we still talking about the same, do we still seem to be talking about the same thing? Are we on the same topic, or has the system suddenly decided to talk about something totally different, which doesn't make sense? So a correctly functioning system would, like a human, make a proper transition. They would say, you say something, and it says, gosh, that's interesting, but it reminds me of, and by that phrasing, you've essentially licensed a totally random reshuffling of what we're talking about, because you're allowed. There are other kinds of properties. For instance, just to stay on the topics, does the system actually understand that the human doesn't want to talk about something anymore? And that means things like reacting appropriately, asking them, so what do you want to talk about? Or noticing things like the system keeps wanting to come back and talk to you about movies for some reason which you don't want to. So these things would be indicative of the how well a system manages history, for example. So I don't know if that's answering the question, sort of. In terms of, well, let me say one more thing about it, which is lexical information is very important. Things like coherence are very important, which means making use of a system that understands how to use context. But this is a slightly higher level than lexical content. So the sorts of properties we would be interested in start off with lexical properties, sequential properties, and we're hoping with the access to the speech, we'll be able to start looking at speech signal properties. Again, things like prosody and hesitation and so forth.
So, Nargis, go ahead if you had a follow-up just now.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you very much for your webinar, first of all, and I'm so excited and happy to participate in this webinar today. Actually, I asked this question because at the moment I work on my thesis project, which involves with evaluation of a chatbot. And that would be so interesting for me to know that you also are working on the same topic, which the result can be so helpful also to me. In fact, coherency is one of the things that I was thinking of, but for my side, it requires labeling some of the answers. I mean, we should somehow label the answers of the bot, which have been already provided by the bot, to understand how coherent they are. And then I thought maybe I can use it in order to have a supervised learning in future for the next coming conversations. So I wanted to know that if this approach works, and do you confirm such an approach, or do you have any other tips for me?
Well, gosh, it's always hard to come up with tips on the fly, but you bring up one thing that I didn't really explicitly call out. So when we do annotation of these data, it's not just one-sided annotation. There are, so like this thing we're talking about, that the system make a contextually appropriate response. That would be annotated as in inappropriate or whatnot. We don't quite have the labels for the labels, but what the system says, or more generally, there should be annotation of each participant's contributions to a conversation, because it would be otherwise difficult to play with models.
So Alex, there were two more questions, one from Christina in the Q&A, another one from Thomas Shah.
Okay, I see the one from Christina.
Yeah.
And a little more about data collection, contribute. So the data collection, what we are going to do.
Alex, could you read the question? I don't think.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you tell us a bit more about data collection? Is it possible to contribute? And if so, how exactly online? Any restrictions, limitations, length, participants? Well, so there's several kinds of contribution. On one level, it's finding people, recruiting people to talk with the systems. And I'm expecting that to be a kind of a workshop-wide activity. Like, you know, just as if you're running a study with human subjects. That said, there's now a second layer of work, which is proofing the transcriptions and correcting any automated annotations that are being produced by a system. That'll be things like topic or intent. And the third layer would be to apply the developing metrics annotations, but I expect that would be sort of an iterative process. Here's a proposal, try it on data, and then tell us why it doesn't work. So those would be kind of things that qualify or not qualify, but are certainly remote contributions. Although when you think about it, anything you do is remote. So what I would like to see is that we actually have several forums on Slack where interested parties can kind of directly interact on specific problems and specific activities within the workshop. So I didn't kind of go through and enumerate each specific activity that's going to happen, although hopefully I've given the audience a sense of what those might be. Okay, so that's Christina's question.
So Thomas's question was, will end-to-end SLU focus on intent recognition only or tries to extract information provided too? And Lazarus answered him in the Q&A saying it also tries to find the entities and their values. Lazarus, do you want to say more verbally?
Yeah, so the idea is that a lot of the SLU research has focused on just going from speech to intents and often into a small number of intents. And there are applications for this. That's why also people looked at it because you would like to do some of these things on devices. But the bigger problem is to be able to go even to intents, not only to intents, but also to entities and their values. So we would like to have that as part of this end-to-end SLU challenge. And we want to see if there are new ideas and new architectures, or if joint training or retraining and fine-tuning produces much better results. There are already some papers in this area about this, I think from Google and others. But we would like to see more experimentation and more innovation in this area.
Yeah, I would say that in kind of more traditional terms, the goal is identifying forms and their slot fillers. I hope Lazarus agrees.
Okay. All right, there are a couple more questions that have popped up. Piotr says, are you also interested in recognizing the intents in human-human conversational speech?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So some of the people in the workshop are believe that some part of our activity has to focus on human-human conversation, because among other things, that's the model where that's our ultimate goal is to, well, to have machines talk like humans, at least converse. So that, I'm not sure about the word recognizing, but it is definitely our plan to look at corpora of human-human interactions and use that as a, basically as a source of information for automated metrics. I'm not sure there's enough of those data, and to be honest, enough interest by a sufficient number of people, but I might be wrong, to do a full treatment of that. But I agree that that would be like really interesting and really important. So we'll see what we do.
All right. Thank you, Alex. Audience, one last chance if anyone has any questions before we start wrapping up.
There was some question that I was trying to type an answer to, but then all of a sudden it disappeared, or I did something wrong here.
Oh, which one?
It was a question about, from, I think, Nargis Rokni. I think it was about the task and whether, what exactly they could participate in. And I was saying that we'll provide a sample, let's say, architecture that we think it can cover both intents and slots and entities.
Yep.
And from then on, participants are free to try their own things and do basically, you know, promote the state of the art in this area. By the way, I wasn't aware that he was online. I want to introduce Marcus Miller, who basically has done a lot of work for this workshop, and basically the slides and so on, a lot of preparation work. And maybe he can also join and talk and say a few words if needed. He's in the participants list.
Yeah, so Hiro, I just promoted Marcus Mueller to panelist. If you could just bring his video on as well. So let me just test two things. One, Lazarus, Nargis's comment disappeared because I wrote her saying that we will follow up by email with her about how she...
Actually, I still see her comment, and yeah. I'm replying to... This is very weird.
We can all follow up by email. In the interest of time, Marcus, do you want to add anything to what Lazarus said? There is one more question in the Q&A.
Okay, yeah, welcome everyone. Let me quickly see if I can find it. Or could you maybe just quickly read it to me, and I can follow up on that?
Okay, so Nargis's question, if you go to the Q&A and the answered part,
okay.
I wanted to also ask you a question, whether it is possible to participate in one of the introduced projects. This is one of Alex's projects. For example, can I just participate in this part of the workshop related to evaluation? So Alex, Nargis is basically asking, can she join your team remotely? And we can discuss this offline with her. And you guys can figure out what role she can play and how she can help and be helped.
So my personal opinion is yes, of course, but the thing to do would be to identify a particular activity, if you will, participate in. I mean, it's great to hang out on the Slack, but it'd be really nice if people would choose a particular activity and then within that activity take responsibility for particular pieces of work.
There is another question for E2E SLU.
Yeah.
Whether it seems to be a dearth of data, what strategies will be examined while building models. So, and of course, I'll ask Marcus to chime in on this more. He went away, but the idea here is that you can start with pre-trained components and then use the relatively small data to do adaptation and fine-tuning. And we hope we are planning to have more data for you to evaluate later in the workshop. Marcus, maybe you can say a few words here.
Yes, I mean, of course, the data problem is a very big problem in that area. As Lazarus already mentioned, we are looking first into pre-training. How can we leverage the existing data sets that we have? And then also the very crucial step is this really training the model end to end, because all the different tasks where we pre-train the individual components on, they may not, so if we, for instance, have an SR system, which has a very low word error rate, that may not be ideal for the task of end-to-end SLU, because as you can imagine, if you, for instance, tune it for minimal word error rate, then it may be prone to dropping certain words and things like this. So there are some errors that you can correct afterwards, and there are some errors you can't correct afterwards. So this is one of the ideas that we have to really train this pipeline end-to-end based on some first tasks that we have.
Right, we are out of time, so let me encourage any attendees who still have questions to communicate with us through email. All of us are fairly easily reachable, Alex, Lazaros, and so on. So let me again thank Alex and Lazaros for a good presentation, everybody for contributing to the discussion. And at this point, Hiro, if you could bring back the workshop organizing staff, Ruth, Lauren, and Vic. I'd like everybody to at least see them briefly. All right. And hi, guys. So to everybody else in the in cyberspace over there, this is the conclusion of our opening presentation. The workshop, of course, will go on for 6 more weeks with high intensity. And you'll see a lot of our activity on the web. And Vic Eisenberg, Vic, can you just wave to everybody? So Vic will be the person posting things for you. And you should be able to see updates on things like we will have a few seminar speakers giving plenary talks. We intend to make that open to the public. Once a week, we will also have a team update where both the teams will give each other and everybody else in the workshop an update on how things are going. Those are meant to be workshop internal, but unless if the teams don't have any problem, we can make those open to the public as well. And then each team has a lab. Team members are encouraged to be in that lab whenever they're logged on and working. That way there'll be a feeling of being together. And those rooms are protected by a password, but the team leaders will have them and they can share them with everybody in the team. And if somebody outside like Nargis wants to come to that and the team is okay with it, of course, it's okay to share it with her as well. So because we are online now, we can actually get many more people involved. In the end, it's still up to the teams to decide who all they want to share their partial thinking with and so on and so forth. So I'll leave that decision to the team leaders. But the teams themselves, as we have it, we'll all have labs to work in. And everybody mark your calendars for July 31st. That's the day we will conclude with a closing presentation. It'll be a little bit longer than this one, since by then we'll have done a lot more work and there'll be many more things to talk about. So at this point, let me throw the floor open once more for any general questions about the whole workshop. Either the attendees or the panelists, if anybody in the panel wants to ask a question. All right. Okay, in that case, let's conclude this day's proceedings and move on to do some good work. And the next event up will be posted on the workshop website. It'll probably be a seminar later this week or early next week. And we'll go on from there and we'll do some activities every day to keep people connected. Right? Joe, Alex, any last comments?
Thanks for organizing this. This is very exciting. Thank you.
You may be muted.
And again, and this is for the audience, if there's something in any of the presentations that you are really interested in, please get in touch. We'll figure out what to do together.
Okay. Najim, Ruth, Lauren, anything from you? No? All right. So normally we would be going for lunch at this time in Baltimore. I don't know what time it is in your time zone, but let's take a break and then get back in an hour.
I see some paints behind you, so maybe we can consume them at the conclusion virtually.
All right, thank you.
There is one final Q&A.
You mean right now?
Right now. They're asking, could the slides shared today be shared on the website? But yes,
of course.
It'll be the entire recording, I guess, unless you separate those out.
No, it is our intention to put this recording on the website. We just check and make sure, like, it looks okay and it's not garbled too badly. But yes, and the presentation then will, of course, have the slides as well. If you specifically want the slides separately, just write to one of us and we will send you the slides. Thanks. Okay, all right. On that note then, everybody, may the force be with you. Let's go do some good work.